Hello, I'm Joel. I'm Joanne's grandson, Jerry's son. I'm a little shaky on speaking in front of people. I haven't done it in a while. In the days before my grandma died, I had one last chance to speak with her where I could be relatively confident she would hear and understand what I was telling her. And I had a chance to call from San Francisco, where I live, but I didn't have time to collect my thoughts before I had already hit the call button. And suddenly I was on the phone, I could see her, and all I could think to say was, "Thank you."
I thanked her for her family, because that family that she built with her love and her choices and her priorities and her values, her example, was a really beautiful family. And that family that she made became my family. I thanked her for Christmases where we'd spend singing, so corny, but it's what we did, and it was fantastic. Singing carols around the piano. It's like a Norman Rockwell painting or something. And singing dinner prayers with 9-part harmonies. It's not every family gets to do that. Most of all, I thanked her for the safety of growing up and knowing in my bones that I was unconditionally loved. In the days before and after her passing, I kept trying to kind of understand who she was, because for so long I had this view that sort of many grandchildren have of their grandmothers, that she is just this sort of overflowing fountain of unconditional love without any added complications that come with having to make you eat your vegetables or go to bed on time or do your homework or go to college or stay in college or you get the idea. Grandparents have a pretty good gig, and I can see the appeal of it. They just get to just love you. And my grandma wasn't likely to tell you what to do or tell her who she was or what her values were outright. We did a project with her in the last few years. We just asked her to tell us stories. And we asked, "What is your motto?" And her response was, "Oh, I would have no such thing." Instead, I found it really helpful to just look at the stories she told, and the stories that were helpful to her and that defined how she saw herself. So in the middle of the Great Depression, which started when she was 2, and kind of defined most of her younger life, she would tell us a story from when she was very young about her dad, Carl. And he had collected a stack of paper loans that he had given to farmers who didn't have the money anymore to pay them. And he had resigned to the fact that he never would. Instead of going and collecting whatever he could on those loans, he sat by the fireplace with my grandma, and one by one he threw the paper in the fire. And his young daughter took notice of those values. That when we give grace and forgiveness to others, we don't give a thought to whether they deserve it, but we give grace and we give forgiveness because people need grace and people need forgiveness, and because we can offer it to them. It's as simple as that. My grandma told a story of what she said was one of her fondest memories of her mother, Amelia, when my grandma's father died suddenly when she was 13. The family had gathered together after her father's funeral, and Amelia had noticed that my grandma was roaming around, kind of lost in the crowd. And this newly widowed, grieving, heartbroken woman found her daughter and asked to sit with her. And 80 years later, when my grandma was asked for the fondest memory of her mother, it was a moment of overwhelming tragedy and grief when her mother, in her own overwhelming tragedy and grief, just sat with her and cared for her. And many years later, when Joanne's, as George said, when Joanne's twin sister Joyce died, Joanne was by all accounts completely lost. And sort of a sadness just washed over her, and many feared that she wouldn't be able to escape it. Around that same time, I was born, and being a newborn baby, I needed diapers and changed and feeding and cuddling, and more simply, I just needed her care. And she cared for me, and she cared for my older brother Carl, and as she cared for us, she found the strength to carry her grief forward. When I was a teenager, she recalled this time in her life to me by telling me that I was just a wonderful baby. I was the best baby. She tried sincerely to convince me that I had the best smelling diapers she had ever smelled. And this is when I started to see the sort of two-way street of grandparent-grandchild relationships, which is that she doesn't have to make me do my homework, which is pretty awesome for her, and I get to know that there's someone in this world that loves me so much that she literally thinks my poop doesn't stink. What she failed to mention was she had lost her sense of smell sometime in the late 70s. It's a detail. It's a relevant detail that she didn't mention. But if I can speak on behalf of her grandsons, Aaron, Jeff, Carl, we grew up knowing that she was irrationally proud of us. That if we were performing in a musical, between the four of us, there were a lot of those, she would be there. There's no question. We always knew that if we needed anything, Grandma would want to help us. I grew up believing that my grandma had kind of carved out this special little delusional part of her heart reserved for her four remarkable grandsons who could do no wrong and deserved every happiness that they could ever imagine. And it may sound like I'm sort of submitting my grandma up for sainthood, but I think it's important to know that I know she was an actual human being. She was a real woman. She could sort of bristle and sharpen her words when she was frustrated or she was uncomfortable, particularly when back pain would get her, or when she lost her sight. It's just immensely frustrating. Jeff told us a fantastic story when we were all together a few weeks ago of her just cursing out a garbage bin, which I thought was the most lovely anecdote of I do not see my grandma cursing out a garbage bin, but context, I guess, is important, maybe. But she was a real complicated human person with all the imperfections and pain and vulnerability and beauty that come with that. And moreover, her values and her choices that were based on those values were not naive, or we weren't privileged. They were based on these hard-earned, deeply rooted wisdom that she had gained in her life. What's become clear to me is that my grandma had lived her life with a steadfast, unburdened love and kindness that was in fact not reserved for her four perfect grandsons. That was just how she treated everyone. If you needed her help and she was able to help you, the rest was a given. There was no hemming and hawing. She knew we weren't perfect, but it was never a consideration in whether or not or how steadfastly she loved you. There was never consideration of what she would get out of it. There were no strings attached. There was no thought of whether you deserved her help or no gauge of how grateful you would be when you received it. Not even a sense of dogmatic obligation that she needed to adhere to. She just had a practical, common sense assessment that you're in need, and I'm able to help you, and that's the end of it. I can't help but think something I've learned to do in my life when I'm overwhelmed, and I can imagine looking back at the times when my grandma was surely overwhelmed, is I've learned to take a moment, be present, to not let whatever stories I might have in my head overwhelm me, and think of practical reality of what's around me. So just, my daughter has a tip when she's feeling a little overwhelmed to simply name five things that are in the room, that are real, that I have a pulpit in front of me that I can feel under my hands, that my family is sitting right in front of me, that candle is lit, that there are 6 lights over there, that there's a piano. And let that calm you down. Let that center you. And I also think about how when Grandma was overwhelmed, when there was so much she maybe didn't feel she could handle, she saw there's a person in front of you and they need your love. This person's right in front of me. I'm just going to love them. And that's the end.